Good morning, everybody. This is our 13th global online seminar in biodiversity informatics. And I'd like to welcome everybody and very happy that everybody's tuned in. Before we get into today's seminar, I'd like to mention to you that next month's seminar, we will have a guest as a professor at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Name is Nico Balkenhol, and he'll be talking about landscape genetics and landscape ecology. So that should be a nice new dimension to the seminar series. For the moment, however, for today, we have a good friend of mine, colleague of mine, Erin Saupe. Erin completed a PhD at the University of Kansas earlier this year, last year, and is now a postdoc at Yale University. And Erin's got a very nice combination of paleo and recent interests, and so she'll be talking essentially about a fairly macroevolutionary perspective on biological diversity and how it evolved. So with that, I'm going to turn you over to Erin, and she can jump into this.
Yeah, so as Tom mentioned, my name is Erin, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University in the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies program. And I primarily consider myself a paleobiologist. But with that said, I have recent leanings as well, and I also study the modern. And what my goal is really is to integrate the modern with what we understand of ecology and evolution from the fossil record. And at the heart of it, I'm really interested in how macroevolutionary and macroecological patterns happen through time. What are the drivers of those patterns? And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is some work that was actually sort of derived in at the University of Kansas with colleagues like Tao and Peterson. And now this work is being done in collaboration with people from the Chinese Institute of Sciences, Harvard, now here at Yale, and then continuing on at the University of Kansas. And so to start my presentation, hopefully you guys can all see it now. So specifically what I'm going to talk to you about
Erin, we don't have a screen share yet, sorry.
Oh, all right. Most important. Screen share. How about now?
Now we have a screen share.
Great. So specifically, what I'm going to be talking to you about is how various macroecological factors impact evolutionary outcomes. And in this context, by evolutionary outcomes, I mean the amount of speciation and extinction that is produced over time as a function of these macroecological characteristics. So in other words, what are the factors that generate biodiversity? And so I first became interested in this topic when chatting with colleagues about a biogeographical extension of Wright's shifting balance theory and his idea of adaptive landscapes. And this concept is illustrated here in this diagram. So the landscape is one of fitness, which is represented by different...
Erin, sorry, we're looking at your PowerPoint, but not in presentation mode.
So it's in presentation mode on my computer.
Okay, well get it sharing your screen rather than PowerPoint.
Let me see if I can fix this. Okay. So how about now?
That's perfect.
Oh, good. Okay. So I was saying that I became interested in this topic when chatting with colleagues about this extension to Wright's shifting balance theory and his idea of adaptive landscapes. So the landscape here is one of fitness represented by different combinations of genes. And as the theory goes, some genes will have higher fitness in the landscape than other combinations of genes. And a population will climb to the peak of one of these gene combinations via natural selection. And historically, it was posited that then a species will fall off this peak or be pushed into an unsuitable valley via genetic drift. So we wondered if we could actually use this analogy of how evolution might happen genetically via natural selection within a biogeographic context to test for the importance of macroecological traits on evolutionary patterns. So the idea was that instead of thinking of genetic landscapes, we could think of environmental landscapes where the axes actually represent environmental variables and combinations of environmental variables. And we can envision a biogeographical landscape where species move about searching for suitable environmental habitat. So the process of habitat tracking would allow species to remain on peaks of suitability until such time that the climate changes and then pushes species into unsuitable valleys. In this scenario, extinction would happen if species can't keep pace with their suitable habitat or can't find suitable habitat as the climate changes, whereas speciation would occur, assuming an allopatric model of evolution, if species are, or populations of species are separated onto peaks of suitability by an unsuitable valley. So in this scenario here, two populations may be on these red peaks of suitability separated by this valley, which would eventually lead to allopatric speciation. So, of course, in this framework, species are assumed to track suitable environments rather than adapting to new conditions. And this tracking via adaptation seems to be borne out in a lot of studies that are currently being produced. We see that species niches seem to be stable within lineages and conserved across speciation events. So when thinking about how species move across the landscape, though, we need to consider not only suitable environment, we also need to consider three other factors, or rather two other factors. And these are represented in this BAM diagram that many of you may be familiar with. And the factors are abiotic environmental factors. That's the suitability, represented by the yellow A circle, and it encompasses things like temperature or precipitation. We can also then think of biotic factors, represented by the orange B circle, and then factors that impact a species' ability to move across the landscape, or its natural dispersal ability, which is represented by the blue M circle. And you can imagine that these factors interact in various ways for different species under different environmental and geological regimes. And it's actually these interactions and their impact on evolution that I'm most interested in teasing apart. And in this study, I focused on two of these factors: a species' abiotic environmental requirements, which I quantified as the breadth of a species niche, as well as sort of its ability to move across the landscape, which I quantified as the distance that it's able to disperse. And I performed a baseline study that asked, in a world where macroevolution is not impacted by biotic interactions, how does a species' niche breadth and dispersal characteristics impact patterns of speciation and extinction in a dynamic environment? And the question, of course, for me is interesting in an evolutionary theory perspective, but it's also becoming increasingly important from a conservation perspective. And that's because climate is changing at an unprecedented rate, faster than we have seen in about the last 2 million years. Species are now being forced to weather and experience these rapid climatic changes. And because of this, the question is how and if differing rates of climate change impact evolutionary outcomes. Stated another way, we could ask, does the impact of species' macroecological characteristics on evolutionary patterns differ depending on the rate of climate change? And by addressing these questions, we can hopefully better predict future changes to biodiversity and potentially mitigate any negative changes. So we controlled for 3 factors in this study: a species' niche breadth, its dispersal capacity, and then the rate and periodicity of climate change. And we formulated 3 main hypotheses regarding these factors. The first is that we expected that species with small niche breadths would have populations that would be more easily isolated from each other and less likely to survive climatic changes, which would increase speciation and extinction potential. And conversely, species with large niche breadths would have populations that were less easily isolated from each other, would be more likely to survive climatic changes and have suitable habitat that persists throughout all of the environmental changes, and this would dampen speciation and extinction potential. Second, we hypothesized that dispersal would exhibit control on patterns of speciation and extinction. We hypothesized that far-reaching species would have populations that would be less easily isolated from each other, and they would be more likely to track and find suitable habitat as the climate is changing. And this would serve to lessen or dampen speciation and extinction potential. On the other side of the coin, species that are geographically limited would have populations that would become more easily isolated from each other, less likely to be able to track suitable habitat as the climate changes, and this would jack up speciation and extinction potential. And then finally, we hypothesized that the relative role of these factors, the niche breadth that we're considering, as well as the dispersal ability that we're considering, would be the same, would not change across different rates and periodicities of climate change, but that in the faster climate change scenarios, we would see increased speciation and extinction rates. And this is essentially because species would be taxed to actually track suitable habitat. They would be in disequilibrium with their climate, so to speak. This would fragment populations and then subsequently jack up speciation and extinction potential. And we tested these hypotheses using simulation experiments where the truth is known about our species' macroecological characteristics. We unfortunately couldn't use the modern system to address this question because it's limited in its temporal scope. We can't watch speciation play out in full on such short timescales in the modern. You may ask, well, why not turn to the fossil record considering you're a paleobiologist? But that is similarly limited in its temporal scale in that we can't actually observe speciation because of the time averaging that occurs in the fossil record. And we can't easily identify species characteristics in the fossil record without worrying about sampling biases. So it's very hard to define dispersal ability and the fundamental niche of a species, both in the modern and in the fossil record as well. So the benefits of simulation experiments is that we can actually know and define the dispersal ability and niche breadths for species, generate environmental change, plop down species into this environmental landscape, let them run amok, and then observe the impact of these characteristics on macroevolutionary patterns. So even though we use these simulation experiments, we try to inject as much biological reality into our framework as possible. And to do so, we use real environmental landscapes that characterize Eurasia. We use real variations in climate, going from cold to warm conditions, which I'll talk to you more about in a bit. And then we used sort of real dimensions for species niches that informed our virtual species. And what's important to note is that to date, no study has actually examined the combined effects of all of these variables on macroevolutionary patterns in a dynamic environment. And so by a dynamic environment, I mean the climate is changing. And we used 3 different climate change scenarios. So here we have a fast climate change scenario at the top, a medium climate change scenario, and then a slow climate change scenario. And for each of these climate change scenarios, we looked at 2 climate variables, temperature and precipitation. And so I said that they were informed by real sort of conditions. So the warm conditions were informed by mid-Holocene temperature and precipitation values. And then the cold conditions were informed by last glacial maximum temperature and precipitation values. And because each species began life as a single pixel in our framework, or a single seed point, we allowed a burn-in period. That's a period where the climate remains stable. I'm circling it here. That a species was allowed to sort of expand and search for suitable habitat within its dispersal ability for this climatically stable period of time before we then began altering climate in one of these 3 ways. The burn-in period lasted for 50,000 model time steps, and then all of these simulations were run for 200,000 model time steps. We tested 2 dispersal abilities, poor and good, which were informed by average seed dispersal capacities in common tree species. Distance was measured in this framework using the Manhattan equation, which computes the length traveled from one data point to the other if a grid-like path is followed. Good dispersers could search up to 5 pixels every 500 years, whereas poor dispersers could only search 1 pixel every 500 years. So what these diagrams are showing, the yellow squares represent suitable habitat, and then the gray squares represent unsuitable habitat. And so you can see that both of these species, so to speak, have the same suitable environmental requirements, same landscape, but that the good dispersers could actually jump over this unsuitable valley and colonize suitable habitat further afield. And it's important to note that when these species are searching this landscape and encountering suitable habitat, every pixel that it encounters that is suitable for it is then instantly inhabited by that species. We define niche breadth based on plants from the Food and Agricultural Organization's database on agriculturally important plant species. And we took breadth parameters from this database for a very large niche breadth species, then a species with a more moderate or middle of the road niche breadth, and then a species with a very small niche breadth. And each dot in this graph here represents a combination of temperature and precipitation values for the entire Eurasian area or geographic area. And so what you see here with temperature on the x-axis and then precipitation on the y-axis is examples of the breadth of the small niche breadth species, which are in purple. And then the green are examples of the medium niche breadth species. And as I sort of hinted at in the beginning of the talk, it's important to note that the niches of these species are stable throughout the duration of our simulations, as well as across speciation events. So we started our simulations from 500 random seed points dispersed across Eurasia, and you can see these points in pink here on the map. And each of the dominant ecoregions within Eurasia were evenly sampled with 50 seed points each. And this resulted in 9,000 simulations from the combination of 500 seed points, 3 niche breadths, 2 dispersal abilities, and then 3 climate change scenarios. All right, so now that we understand a bit about the parameters and the input necessary for these simulations, let's take a look at one in action. So I'm going to be showing you a video. Just to orient you, this sine curve here is how the climate is changing. That's controlling each pixel and how the value of each pixel is changing from warm conditions, which are up here, to cold conditions, which are down here. We have this stable environmental condition in the beginning, which was the burn-in period that I told you about. This is where the conditions remain warm and a species is allowed to search for suitable habitat and expand its distribution before the climate then begins changing. Then down here, we have this panel called dispersal distribution. That's where essentially a species is able to get to, is able to disperse to. We then have the middle panel, which is the potential distribution. That's the species' existing fundamental niche at a given time. And that niche, or that potential distribution, is going to change as the climate changes. And then finally, we have the overlap of the two. So that's just where the species is actually able to get to. So to start the simulations, and you can see that the distribution is expanding, the species is searching for suitable habitat, you see that here. And then as we get to the end of this burn-in period, the climate will start to change, and you'll begin to see this dynamic interaction and how the distribution changes as the climate changes. And so from these simulations, we can tabulate speciations and extinctions. And we did so in a vicariant framework for speciations. So speciations was counted when a population has been isolated for greater than 10,000 time steps in the model. And then extinction was a little easier to tabulate. We counted extinction when all of the suitable pixels for a species disappeared for that species. And so it's a pretty strict extinction criterion. So you can imagine that we didn't have much extinction across all of the simulations, but it was fairly straightforward and didn't involve a lot of assumptions. So when thinking about how these variables interact to produce macroevolutionary patterns, we need to actually consider the difference between environmental space and geographic space. And in our simulations, but also when we're considering sort of the real world and how species interact with real climate change, a species possesses a particular set of environmental conditions that it can tolerate. And these conditions may or may not be represented in geographic space. Moreover, these conditions map onto geography in really complex ways and often in fragmentary ways, which will obviously then affect where a species can be distributed. Then when climate changes, this adds an additional level of complexity, and the conditions that a species finds suitable may now be more or less represented in geography. And of course, then this affects how a species then occupies geography. So in the example here, the species with the smaller blue niche, which you can see in environmental space, loses all of the existing environmental conditions. And that means that it's no longer present in geography. So this is really just to illustrate the dynamic among species' niche characteristics, environmental change, and potential distributions, and how complex these dynamics really can be. And this is without even considering the added complexity of dispersal and where a species can actually get to in its in geographic space. So the extinction and the speciation from our simulations can then be documented in phylogenetic trees. And I'm showing you an example for only one of the species seeds that we looked at under different climate scenarios, which are on the y-axis, and then different dispersal scenarios, which I'm showing horizontally here. And from these trees, we could calculate the number of splitting events, which represent the speciations, and we could also document extinctions, like this poor hapless lineage here that didn't make it to the end of the simulation. And then from these trees, we could calculate the number of speciation and extinction events for all of the different macroecological permutations. And we can begin using this data to at least qualitatively assess some of our hypotheses. So our first hypothesis, if you remember back, was that species with smaller niche breasts would have a positive impact on rates of speciation and extinction. And this is held up by the data where we see this stepwise decrease in speciations with increasing niche breadth. Extinctions, however, over here are a little harder to interpret. But you see with the pooled data, that's the data in yellow, that we also see a stepwise decrease in extinctions with increasing niche breadth. Our second hypothesis was that poor dispersers would experience more speciations and more extinctions. And we see from the data a fairly large jump in speciations among poorly dispersing species, but extinctions, again, here on the right, are a little messier in that there are many extinctions in species with good dispersal ability under the slow climate change scenario, which is a little counter to what we had originally hypothesized. If we break apart these patterns and examine the impact of niche breadth within dispersal ability categories, the results are congruent with what we would expect. So that's to say that most speciation events occur among species with small niche breadths and poor dispersal abilities, and the lowest number, or least number of speciation events occur among species with large niche breadths and good dispersal ability. And what's interesting, actually, is that we see species with large niche breadths and poor dispersal abilities have qualitatively similar numbers of speciations compared with species with small niche breadths and good dispersal abilities. So the results appear to be, again, a little more varied for extinction when we're looking within these dispersal categories. If you remember, this may be a function of our strict extinction criterion. You have to have all suitable pixels for a population or a species disappear for a species to actually go extinct. So we're not really getting much extinctions across these simulations. And what we're seeing is that actually the most extinctions occur among species with small niche breadths and good dispersal ability, which again is sort of the opposite pattern of what we were seeing for the speciations and what we had originally hypothesized. So turning from these more qualitative results, we can quantitatively examine patterns using a multivariate statistical approach. And we use generalized linear models with a Poisson distribution and a logic link function to analyze these patterns. And then using these multivariate statistics and models, we performed hierarchical partitioning analyses to identify the most likely explanatory factors in our model. And this method provides a measure of the strength of effect of each factor that is largely independent from the effect of other factors. So when all of the data are combined and examined together, this is including climate change as a factor, we see that all of the factors are significant. So that's dispersal ability, niche breadth, and climate change scenario. And we also see significant interactions among all of these factors. So if we look then, if we sort of dig deeper into this pattern and look within the climate change scenarios, we can see a general pattern of poor dispersers producing more speciations with the greatest number of speciations in those species with small niche breadths. So that's represented here by the yellow bars. We can also see that the greatest number of speciations are produced in the fastest climate change scenario, and then they ramp down as the rate of climate change decreases. The extinction results, again, are pretty messy when considering within the climate change scenarios, but they suggest that species with small niche breadths go extinct more readily than species with large niche breadths. But with that said, we don't really see a clear signal or a clear pattern. And often species with good dispersal ability seem to undergo more extinctions, which again was counter to what we had originally hypothesized. We can unpack these results, though, further and use hierarchical partitioning analyses to allow for more insight into which variables are actually contributing most to patterns of speciation and extinction. And so, considering speciation, what we see is that in the faster climate change scenario, niche breadth actually produces the strongest independent effects, whereas in the slower climate change scenario, dispersal contributes most to explaining observed patterns. And we see the same pattern in extinctions. So again, in the faster climate change scenario, niche breadth seems to dominate, whereas in the slower climate change scenario, dispersal seems to dominate. And this is really quite interesting and suggests that the macroecological trait producing patterns of speciation and extinction will vary depending on the rate of climate change. And this really makes some degree of sense, given that when the environment changes rapidly, there may actually be no time for species to track suitable habitats before the environment then shifts again. And the result is that a species' innate environmental requirements will actually determine how it weathers, no pun intended, this change. And as a result, species with smaller niche breadths will usually have higher rates of speciation and extinction because the environment they occupy is more likely to disappear, and so that's going to lead to extinction. But because of the specificity of their requirements, it's also more likely to sort of fragment as the climate changes, and this is going to isolate populations, which will cause allopatric speciation. Now, on the other hand, if climate change or environmental change is slow enough, then species would have sufficient time to track suitable environments. And at this point, how well a species tracks those environments, basically their dispersal ability, seems to make more of a difference in speciation and extinction potential compared to these innate environmental tolerances. So these results, I think, are pretty exciting, and they suggest that we can generate differential patterns of biodiversity based solely on species macroecological characteristics in combination with these differing rates of climate change. And these patterns were generated using this baseline model that implemented pretty simple sinusoidal climate change and, importantly, discarded the impact of biotic interactions. So to come full circle back to the three main hypotheses in the beginning, the general gist is that they mostly held up, particularly when we're considering speciations. So species with poor dispersal ability and species with small niche breadths produced more speciations overall. And the combination of these two factors, poor dispersal ability and small niche breadth, produce the greatest number of speciations out of all of the different macroecological combinations. The extinction results, as I've been saying throughout, are a little harder to interpret, probably because of our strict extinction criterion. And so we're not really super confident making grand claims as to these patterns yet. But with that said, it does seem that species with small niche breadths go extinct more frequently, but species with poor dispersal abilities don't seem to show this pattern. It seems that actually potentially it's pretty even between the two categories, or maybe even in the slow climate change scenario, we have some differential pattern to good dispersers going extinct more easily. So, and then finally, regarding our hypothesis of climate change, it was supported in that more speciation and extinction occurred in the faster climate change scenarios and then ramped down as climate slowed. But the relative importance of dispersal ability and niche breadth was not constant across these climate change scenarios. Instead, what we found was that in the faster climate change scenario, niche breadth was more important, and in the slower climate change scenario, dispersal was more important. And the fact that the relative role of species macroecological characteristics differed depending on the rate of climate change really has potentially implications for understanding how today's climate change will impact biodiversity. The climate is changing more rapidly than any species has experienced in quite some time, say 2 million years-ish. And at least preliminarily, these results suggest that we may need to focus conservation efforts on species that have small niche breaths, both in terms of preventing species from going extinct, but also in terms of preserving that diversity or those species that are more likely to give rise to new species and to generate new biodiversity. With that said, the conservation implications may actually be more nuanced than that, than just focusing on niche breadth. And that's because the rate of climate changes differently depending on where you are in the globe. And that's indicated here by this figure of how much the temperature has changed in the last 50 or so years. And so perhaps what we need to do is focus on different traits depending on the rate of climate change. Maybe in those regions that experience slower rates of climate change, we need to focus on dispersal, whereas in those regions that are experiencing higher rates of climate change, we need to focus more on niche breadth. So these simulation studies represent ongoing work, though. Of course, this is a big project and a multi-institution project. So we'd like to add increased complexity to our simulation framework. We'd also, so one of the main things is we'd like to fix our extinction criterion. So we'd like to implement some sort of threshold for when a population would go extinct, say a minimum number of pixels. And it would also be interesting to test different thresholds to see if the patterns change depending on the threshold that we're implementing. We also want to apply a more realistic climate model and use actual continuous climate data from the last glacial maximum to the present. And this will have the effect of introducing more realistic perturbations in the simulations and essentially more realistic speciations and extinctions. And what's really exciting is actually that we've already obtained this data in collaboration with the Hadley Climate Center, and we're currently working on implementing this in our new simulation framework. And then finally, we are taking our simulations to a global scale to look at biodiversity patterns in general and actually whether we can simulate these patterns of diversity using species macroecological characteristics and climate changes alone. And what will be really interesting is whether the patterns that we're obtaining in our macroecological studies hold up when we add this additional complexity and then take it to this global scale. So with that, I'd like to thank lots of people, mostly my collaborators for their help with this project, the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies, which is currently funding me, as well as the Department of Geology and at the University of Kansas that funded me when this project was initiated. And that I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I will hopefully stop screen sharing and come back on without any issues.
We're back.
All right, excellent.
So thank you very much, Erin. That was really neat. To the viewers, if you have questions for Erin, email them to me, town@ku.edu, or the biodiv training at gmail.com, or simply via the Google Plus page. You can also deposit a question. So if we get your questions in the next couple minutes, Erin will go ahead and answer them. And if not, she may be able to give you an answer by email. I actually have perhaps not so much a question, maybe more asking Erin to comment just a little bit more in detail. So you have built these simulations with kind of relatively few things that are changing. And maybe many of our viewers would be thinking, well, there are no biotic interactions in there, and there's no niche evolution in there. So could you kind of for each of those two additional variables, could you perhaps comment on what they might do if you were to include them, or what they wouldn't do? Just kind of very generally, kind of what do you think? What do you think of the idea of excluding those?
Yeah, so we excluded these variables because we were really interested in sort of stripping down macroevolutionary patterns, speciation and extinction, and sort of biodiversity patterns in general, spatially, to sort of the base of what it can explain. So can climate change, in conjunction with a species' niche breadth and dispersal characteristics, generate observed speciation and extinction and biodiversity patterns? And so what we're seeing is that you don't need to invoke niche evolution or biotic interactions to get differential speciation and extinction and different spatial patterns in diversity. It's really just a function of sort of abiotic environmental change and a species interaction with that abiotic environmental change in terms of their niche preferences. I think if we include biotic interactions, I'm not actually sure that we would get any change in some of the patterns that we're seeing, but it would certainly be something interesting to pursue, and something that we've been talking about as a group, to maybe limit sort of the number of species that can occupy a certain pixel at a time. That would be one way to add biotic complexity to this framework. And then we've talked about sort of evolving the niche, and there's many ways to do that. You could do it randomly, you could follow a certain model of evolution, but again, I really don't think that that's going to impact the main conclusions, which is that you can really generate these patterns of biodiversity based solely on a species' inherent characteristics, and not invoking natural selection or any selective process like that.
Excellent. Yeah, I find it very, very interesting that so much can be explained with so relatively little.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Maybe that points to, more than anything, the complexity of landscapes and how that.
Yeah, so I think it really speaks to the complexity of landscapes and environmental change through time, and how that can really just drive species splitting and separating and evolving across these landscapes.
Okay, well, as is a little too frequent with this online forum, we don't have questions in yet. So okay. They usually come in about 2 minutes after we end the broadcast. So thank you, Erin, for your time this morning. And everybody, we have, again, a very interesting seminar coming up on May 28th about landscape genetics and landscape genomics. So that'll be announced shortly, and we'll hope to see everybody back here. Thanks again, Erin.
All right, thank you, Town, and thank you, everyone, for listening.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks again.